Welcome, dear guests, dear journalists, dear audience, and I am more than happy to start our today's expert discussion, which is dedicated to Russia's expansion in Africa, hybrid methods, and strategic goals. So today, our experts, which will discuss these issues, are Marta Olinik-Demochko, PhD in political science, independent researcher, African expert, a Global Ukraine Foundation. She will join us online. Mikhailo Samus, director of the New Geopolitics Research Network. Thank you for joining us. And also Andrei Rudek, hopefully will join us soon. He is social and behavioral sciences PhD, political scientist. And also I, Vladimir Slavyan, the head of Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, will moderate this discussion. Also, our today's participants from press tour from Africa are Seikou Jammeh from Gambia, who represents Journalists for Justice, Ogo Jackson Biko, Kenya, nation of Bikozu.com website, Oring Singh from South Africa, Eyewitness News, and Ibeweke Nicholas Leonard from Nigeria, Premium Times of Nigeria. So today's topics for discussion are informational and humanitarian expansion of Africa, of Russia in Africa, and hopefully we will also discuss their toolkit and narratives which Russia tries to implement regarding the African countries. Also, we will discuss consequences of regional security posed by Russia's military political presence in Africa and challenges in the context of expanding Ukrainian economic and diplomatic presence in Africa. I'd also like to mention that this press tour and this event take place as a part of Unfold Ukraine to Global South project implemented by Ukraine Crisis Media Center in cooperation and coordination with the Open Society Foundation and funded by the International Reconnaissance Foundations. So to start with, I'd like to make a brief presentation. I'd like to ask our techniques to switch the screen to the presentation. So this is the main priorities of Russia in Africa, which was indicated by the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group. And here I'd like to mention that given the political and diplomatic dimension, Russia's main goal is, of course, to whip out Western countries from their traditional regions of influence and provide support for anti-Western movements and regimes in Africa. And I think that we should focus especially on the matter of alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which Russia is trying to provide weaponry and supply with private military companies to these countries, so to whip out the French influence from this particular region. Also, another point is creating a picture of so-called global majority allied with Russia in its crusade against the West, and Moscow is trying to engage African countries to portray its initiatives as the initiatives of the vast majority of the globe. And also the involvement of African countries in cooperation within BRICS and other organizations which Russia use to circumvent sanctions and boost its economy. However, we all know that the main player in these organizations, like Shanghai Organization or BRICS, is China. Also, another point is that Moscow is trying to involve African countries into its peace initiatives, and given the experience of the last year initiative of presidents of several African countries, peaceful initiative regarding the war between Moscow and Kiev, was used by Putin during their visit to Moscow, was used by Russian leader to boost the peaceful negotiations which are favorable to Russia. And during those press conferences jointly with African leaders, Putin at first time depicted this the plot of peaceful treatment which Moscow tried to reach in Istanbul, and against it Ukraine de facto was defeated in diplomatic terms. So it means that Russia tries to use African countries to legitimize its attempts to finalize the war on its terms in the diplomatic dimension. So another dimensions is also food and energy security, and I'd like to mention the here importance of grain corridor for stability of food supplies to the African countries. And also here it is very important to mention that Russia is trying to be a pioneer of peaceful atom, of nuclear energy in Africa, and currently the leading company of Russia in this sphere, Rosatom, is implementing projects or has some treaties with at least 20 African countries, and this poses a long-standing dependence of these countries from Russian technologies in energy sphere. Also, if we have a look at the military technical dimension, everybody know that Russia is implementing its activities with Russian private military companies, mainly Wagner, but there are plenty of others private military companies which are active in Africa, and this is one of the main toolkit which helps Russia to impose its political presence and influence in the continent, given that Russia is lack of economical and energy toolkit leverages to have an influence on current policies of African countries. Another matter is the initiative of African Corps, which was laid in 2023, but we are mentioning that the vast majority of personnel of its African Corps is former Wagners, and the number is about 200, which is not completely not enough to cover all the continent. But anyway, during Russian attempts to siege Kharkiv Oblast, and during the recent attempts to attack Ukraine in Kharkiv Oblast, many of these mercenaries, which were part of African Corps, were redeployed from Africa to Ukraine. So until now, we do not obtain any specific information how this initiative of Russian militaries will be implemented. And also, it is traditionally from Soviet times, Russia tries to maintain its weaponry market in Africa, and the supplies of weapons to military and conflict zones is very important for Moscow right now, even in the situation when it lacks armored vehicles and tanks in the war in against Ukraine. But anyway, for Russia it is important to maintain its supplies, because otherwise it will lose these markets towards Beijing, towards China and Turkey, which raised its weaponry supplies to the African countries. Another point is turnover and investments between Russia and African countries, and we see here that it is not comparable with United States and China, especially because the amount of 14 up to 18 billions of dollars per year. It's not enough in economical terms to maintain a leading role in the continent for Russia. So that means that Kremlin would lay on and bet on its military presence and activities of private military companies. Also, Russia is very interested in access to lithium companies and diamond deposits, given that these companies are operated by inner circle of Russian elites, and this creates possibilities to make like a pockets for gray zone spendings for the war and corruption rent, which is traditionally Russian elites dependent on. And also, I'd like to mention supplies of oil products from Russia to African countries, which raised 3 times during 2023 and reached about 17,000 tons of oil during last year, which indicates that Russia tries to engage African countries into the trade to overcome the effect of sanctions and the split all the economical ties with Western countries, especially European countries. And also the last point is development of trade in national currencies is also the dimension for Russia, which is very actively discussed with representatives of African countries and Russian diplomats, because it is very crucial for Russia to raise its volumes of trade in national currencies, given all the restrictions which were imposed by Western countries. And finally, we would like to mention education and training personnel dimension of cooperation between Russia and African countries, and here Russia tries to act more actively in the field of university interaction, and also currently about 35,000 African students study in Russia, while it is very important to mention that since 2022 we are witnessing the raising of scholarships for students from Africa, and it raised 4 times, and now it is about 5,000 scholarships which is sponsored by Russian government, is praised to students from Africa. And that gives us the ground to the analysis about Russian attempts to engage more specialists from Africa and maintain influence with such a toolkit. And also, I'd like to mention many newses and such stories how Russia tries to engage these African students to subscribe and to contracts with Russian army, and this is also the topic which I think we shall mention today about the security matter for students from Africa in Russia, because given attempts of Russian militaries to engage the students into the warfare against Ukraine. And the last point is about promoting humanitarian and informational influence in Africa. Is obviously Russia try to fuel the anti-colonial agenda, and that is the strategy to portray themselves as successors of Soviet Union and use all the topics, all the narratives which were quite actively spread during the Cold War. So that is the matter for us to portray Ukraine and all other post-Soviet countries as the participants of these Soviet attempts, and also we have to highlight the topic that Ukraine also made many inputs in this in Soviet help towards African countries. So that not obviously Russia is not the direct successor of Soviet Union, because 1/3 of Soviet GDP came from Ukraine. And also I'd like to highlight the activities of Россотрудничество, which is a branch of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and nowadays there are 7 countries in Africa which obtain such Russian domes, Russian houses, which is operated by Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also there were declared the plans to open 10 other Russian houses in other 10 African countries. So that means that Russia tries to split its and spread its influence through different means, not only with media sphere, but also with organizations. And just one example of such organization which is very actively portray and propaganda and spread Russian propaganda in Sahel region is African Initiative, which this is a screenshot from their website, which was established in 2023. So we are witnessing that Russia is trying to circumvent and try to fuel anti-Western sentiments in Sahel region, and they make a stake specifically on 3 countries: Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso. These photos are from Russian-Africa Summit of 2023. The next summit will be held in 3 years, so we may conclude that Russia tries to use these pictures from which came from the period of Cold War, because this is how Soviet Union portrayed the national movements of African countries, and nowadays Russia tries to use these narratives of Soviet propaganda in its nowadays attempts to gather African countries under its umbrella. And the last one is a topic which is currently in the shadow of the main informational media attempts and focus. It is the attempts of Russian Patriarchate to impose its activities overall in Africa, because all the more than 50 countries of African continent were included into the Patriarchal Exarchate of Africa, which is the body of Russian Orthodox Church, and we all know that Russian Church is completely under the control of the Kremlin and is often used by Russian propaganda to impose the main narratives of Russia, which is laid in the field of anti-Western propaganda and attempts to undermine Ukraine and support for Ukraine. So that is it, and now I'd like to move to the discussion and give floors to Marta Oleynik-Dimochko, PhD in political science, independent researcher and African expert. Thanks, Marta, for joining us.
So tell me, please, do you hear me very well? Yes?
Like to turn to Ukrainian language.
She will speak in Ukrainian.
Yeah, she will speak in Ukrainian. So you will have to turn on your headphones.
First of all, good afternoon. I'm grateful to organizers and our guests from the African countries. Thank you for this discussion and the opportunity to exchange ideas on this really important topic. I'm so sorry that I use Ukrainian, not English. I do hope that you get the interpretation. Everything's gonna be clear. As Volodymyr said, the long-term goal of Russia is to create this agenda of international relations. Russia was a powerful voice and a power where in Asia and Africa and Latin America, this voice is heard. But for the country which fully ignores the international law and wants to ensure that one's interests are met, and they actually try to push it so hard. So for them, these are proper tools in their foreign policy, bribing elites, interfering in the process, propaganda, and this whole thing was done by Russia and Ukraine previously. So for us, this is really a sensitive issue. We feel it and we understand what we talk about. As a result of those manipulations, Russia is getting resources in Africa, getting contacts, shaping new reality, and sometimes we have this thing as state capturing, when basically they're capturing states not with power, but with soft power. I'd like to focus on what Russia is doing, in which countries, and how can we actually interfere with it. Russia's interference in African political life, we can say that there are three aspects: international platform, then interfering in elections, and creating social turbulence via media and NGOs to create an incorrect agenda, false social demand. The first group is working on international platforms, and here we can say that Russia is using its veto right in UNSC to actually block the resolutions which are aimed at condemning the leaders of certain countries. Let's recall those two resolutions about South Sudan in 2014, 2015, those who were accused in human rights violations during the civil war. We can recall Russia blocking resolution against the Burundi president in 2015, who decided to extend his term. And also, they supported the politicians by Russians congratulate them after elections, even if elections were, let's say, very far from democratic and were not transparent. There were violations. Second group, interference in the election process, political life of the country. The brightest example is Central African Republic, where Russians were deeply rooted in the political life of the country, so hard that they solve even political problems. They're brokers in these peace treaties. Valery Zakharov, who is representative of the private military company Wagner, who was the advisor of the African president. And thanks to efforts, they managed to get rid of the Minister of Foreign Affairs back then, because the minister really was against the expansion of cooperation with Russia. In 2020, when we had elections in Central African Republic, Russia actively was using the tools of information campaigns on creating black reputation for opposition politicians to ensure that people fully support the president. And another example we can put, for example, elections in Madagascar, 2018, where there was a huge group of Russian propagandists and journalists who were, publishing information in media after paying a lot of money, and they were providing some praising for the president. They were trying to bribe the candidates, for them to get out of the process. And they were even inviting technical candidates, a pastor of the church, for one to be elected. In Madagascar election, Russians understood that president's chances are very low, so they aimed their efforts at another candidate who actually won the election. So that's how Russia makes sure that proper candidates become presidents who will later help them to get access to resources, contacts, and to be politically loyal. Another example, Mozambique 2019, when they used and engaged this organization and International Anti-Crisis Center affiliated with Wagner. And there was a survey during the election. And according to its results, it's like the ruling party had to win. But these surveys are prohibited in Mozambique. Russia quite often, when they interfere in election process in African countries, they use such tool as false electoral observation. Association of Free Studies and International Cooperation. And this association sends their missions during the African elections, confirming that elections were fully transparent, with no violations, with no problems. We can recall that this mission was in Mozambique in 2019, Zimbabwe 2018. Third thing, how Russia acts. So they are creating turbulence, creating social opinions in African states. All these manifestations with Russian flags, portraits of Putin, we had there before riots. And in these moments, Russia uses the network of NGOs, which are friendly to Russia, special bloggers, and activists like Kemi Seba, who distributes Russian propaganda because he has big audience. Another thing we can recall, August 2023 in Ghana, a group of young men wanted to organize a riot for Wagner, but they knew that for Ghana, this is not typical, this type of narrative. When these were arrested, they found out that one of the organizers of this meeting, he gave interview to Russian propagandist Semyon Bokov and said that in African states, they plan a lot of riots. We can see that Russia is using resources and expanding its efforts. If we conclude, we can see such tools as bribing, false observations at elections, manipulating with agenda, misinformation to get some benefit and profit. Russia is putting everything in bright cover. And speaking of cooperation and old connections with Africa, unfortunately, they really just want to use African continent because of its resources. What to do with that is the question. And I can see three key directions on how can we actually obstruct that. International cooperation in African Union, ECOWAS, for example, this organization can be like a flagship one to ensure the transparency of elections. Special monitoring missions should be there. Then working with African population, increasing media literacy and critical information and critical thinking and perceiving information. Cooperating with Ukrainian NGOs who also handle that. Media literacy for population is quite a painful thing for so many countries in the world, Painful spot. Third conclusion, like what can we do? The journalists' investigations, they must present truth. Of course, we have African countries where it's really hard for journalists to present truth, especially if we remember President Yanukovych, pro-Ukrainian journalists had some bad times then. But maybe some networking, maybe some cooperation, exchanging experience, joint investigation to bring the truth to people, for them to understand what Russia is doing, what its actual interests are and what they want to achieve and get from African countries. Thank you for attention. My colleagues will add, and I'm so sorry if that was fast. Yes, that was really fast, but still, thank you. Thank you so much, Marta. Thank you for this really comprehensive review of the processes that we have in various African states and where Russia is engaged directly to disseminate its impact.
To give floors to prominent Ukrainian military expert Mikhailo Samus and ask him to provide his vision of Russian goals in the military and military sphere and activities of private military companies. And I think that it's a very actual topic given last developments in Mali.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to welcome to Ukraine our African colleagues and friends. And actually, it's you are a rare guest from Africa in Ukraine. And unfortunately, because of the wartime, it's impossible to get all of possible, let's say, rest and relax here in Kiev. But I hope that you will get some and you will find the historical and the real beauty of capital of Ukraine, and maybe you a little bit understand why we're fighting with Russians now, because of my colleagues told a lot of Russian influence and in Africa. But I think that you will talk about it and about the African situation. I like to, of course, we could speak about the Wagner Group, and I could give you our understanding. What does it mean? For example, any private military company from Russia, it's always connected with Russian secret services. So it doesn't exist any private military companies in Russia at all, in legal space of Russia, because it's prohibited in Russia. So any so-called private military companies or African Corps or something like this, it's always connected to FSB or GRU. It's obviously. So it's impossible to find any private military companies. It's always state organization with functionality of providing the Russian state, let's say, goals. And of course, in Ukraine, if you'd like to ask something about Russian influence and Russian charge or Russian militaries, ask in Ukraine, because we are living for 1,000 years with Russians. We know everything about them, and all of this agenda, especially. It's very funny sounds that Russia is explaining in Africa or global South countries about Russian anti-colonialism. If it's from the people who's really from empire. Russia is empire, which is fighting now against Ukraine, which was a former part of the empire. And in the same time, they're trying to explain that Russia is fighting against imperialism in global scene. So it's always paradoxically listen it and look at this, how Russia trying to use this anti-imperialism contest and the narratives being actually empire. So if you're talking about the situation now, maybe a little bit on the war and between Ukraine and Russia, because I think it's your interest to visit Ukraine. In reality, we are on a critical and crucial point of this war, because in the geopolitical context, it's understandable that next year will be very, very, let's say, turbulent because of the United States election. And as the candidates now defined, it's Kamala Harris and Trump, they have different views and opinion on how the Russian-Ukrainian war could develop. Trump, for example, is trying to say that he will stop the war. It's in Ukraine we perceive it like pretty unreal, but nevertheless, all of these leaks and publications from the former advisors of Trump that it's possible that Trump will propose something to Ukraine and something to Russia, trying to find a compromise, and on this background, try to find a way to stop the war and try to find some ways on the negotiations. In Ukraine, it's very skeptical on this. But at the same time, the problem is for Kamala Harris, for example, is that they basically don't have any, they, at least for now, don't have any platform and position. How they will, I mean, the Democrats will try to resolve this war and then trying to help Ukraine to stop the Russian aggression. Because, to be honest, till now, the Biden administration helping a lot to Ukraine, but unfortunately they don't have the strategy how to achieve the victory in this war for Ukraine, because it's aggressive war, and it should be clear that the stop of this war could be very simple. From Ukrainian point of view, it's the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukrainian territory since the 1991. The second, it's territorial integrity. Second, it's of course withdrawing all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, of course. I will explain a little bit later why Crimea is so important for Ukraine and actually for Russia. And of course, the compensation, Russian compensation for any damages here in Ukraine, it's a lot of money. It's basically a little bit less for now than the $1 trillion, because Russians destroyed here a lot. And the last, actually, it's a punishment of the war criminals. It's very simple for Ukrainian position how to stop this war. Unfortunately for Russians, of course, it's absolutely opposite position, and it's like ultimatum from the Putin that Ukraine should say no NATO. Ukraine should say actually no European Union, which is basically our intentions to be the part of the NATO and European Union anyway. Next, Ukraine should, of course, give up the territories which Russians want to have under own control. Of course, first of all, Crimea, but Donbass and all of occupied territory by now, you could see on the map. And of course, the influence and the impact on the internal situation in Ukraine. I mean that language policy or our historical and educational policy, etc., cultural policy. So we need to use imperial agenda, but not Ukrainian agenda on our internal life from the Soviet times, etc., which is absolutely unacceptable from Ukrainian side. So this is a crucial year, and from my point of view, as a military analyst, for Ukraine and Russia now, it's a critical period to achieve the final achievement and results on the battlefield. So I think that 2025, as United States and European Union and other players, geopolitical players like China, maybe India, will try to stop the war. So for Ukraine and Russia, the most important now, 2025, again, as much as possible on the battlefield to try to prepare as better as possible for negotiations. So we now on the very crucial period on the battlefield, and you could see that Russia every day trying to get more and more territories in Ukraine. And for Ukrainian side, the most important now it's of course to destroy as much as possible Russian troops, and which is very important, to have a long-range instruments to destroy military infrastructure on Russian territory, kind of 300 kilometers beyond the battlefield, and of course Crimea. Every day we have strikes on Crimea with cruise missiles, with drones, etc. Now we have push out Russian fleet from Crimea, basically. So Russian Black Sea fleet now out of Crimea, They basically have a basis on Russian territory, on Novorossiysk. Ukrainian forces strike every day and every night on Crimean air defense, Crimean Russian air bases. So the main plan for now is to prepare for the occupation of Crimea. Why is it important for Ukraine and Russia? Because Crimea actually it's a key point geopolitically for Ukraine. If you imagine that Russia occupied Crimea and actually Ukraine will sign something to allow Russia to keep Crimea under control, it means that Ukraine will be out of the exit to the sea, which is a clause in the Ukrainian possibility and geopolitically to be a closed state without any sea possibility. Even we have a very long tradition on the sea and navy and of course commercial fleet, etc. And geopolitically will be the state without any possibility to influence on the south, and we don't have the south corridor to Mediterranean, to other parts of the world, and actually Russia is trying to close the Ukrainian exit and opportunities to communicate with southern direction only to west on the north. But for Ukraine, it means a disaster from geopolitical point of view, from the economical point of view, and of course the point of view of the historical capabilities and possibilities to have contact to the south. So I'd like to ask you to participate in this discussion and make questions on it, because I think that your opportunity to be here, to have a more understanding why we fighting against Russian aggression, because I'm sure that you have a lot of information from Russian on all kind of Russian sources that actually Ukraine is it's a failed state, it's a dividing state, that Russia traditionally have a lot of culture and ethnical influence here, that half of Ukrainian people it's Russians in reality, but of course it's a complicated question, I mean, to understand, but I think it's a great opportunity for you to understand that Russian approach and Ukrainian approach to the situation, because you are on the center, on the historical center of Rus civilization, because it's a different between Rus and Russia. It's historically absolutely different. And Kiev, it's a city with thousands of years of history. And actually the church, if we're talking about the Russian hybrid approach on the Russian Orthodoxical Church, the Rus church was created here, not in Russia. So to understand where you could find a real origin Orthodox Church for Rus, it's here. You see here a lot of very old churches, and this is original church. It's not build new churches in Russia, which is actually creating empire understanding of Rus and Ukrainian church. So I think that we have opportunity to discuss with you a lot of questions, so I will give the floor to Volodymyr to continue discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mihailo, very much for such a complex analysis, and I fully agree that I think we should start our discussion, and I really encourage our today guests, journalists from African countries, to ask their questions to our experts, and I think that Mihailo and Marta will give their vision on the matters you are interested in. So please, whether you have any questions to our experts.
Maybe some positions and maybe...
Yeah, of course, any statements.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Nicholas. In the past, from the beginning of this year, I've taken particular interest in the Russia involvement in Africa, and I basically understood Russian role in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and even in Chad and the whole of the Sahel. We have this NGO. I mean, one of the most prominent faces of the NGO is Kemi Saba, who is a French national, but originally from Benin. And all the roles that Russia is playing, this multifaceted approach to regaining the influence it lost after the end of the Cold War. Because if you understand, the Soviets used to be very influential in Africa around the Cold War period. But after the Cold War period, it lost its influence, and the West became the most influential partner in most African countries, you know. But what we're seeing today is that over the years, the West has become complacent. The West has become, okay, I mean, we have been partners for close to 40, 30 years with these people. So the West have become, they've taken the partnership with Africa for granted, which has basically given Russia the inroad to come in. And if you look at places like Francophone Africa, over the years, there have been growing discontent with France specifically. They have, this room have given chance to a lot of narrative, anti-French narrative in most of, because French have been seen to have been supportive of despotic government in those regions, and people believe that there's a lot of evidence that French were being exploitative of some of the minerals from those countries and not giving the people enough back the returns that is needed. So we have these NGOs, the like of Kemi Saba and others, who are basically lashing in on those discontent, those anti-French discontent that already existed in this country, and playing them up. So what we are dealing with is not exactly fake news. Of course, there's an aspect of disinformation, which Russia is very, very good in using characters to spread. I mean, that's that. But also, it's playing against using the nuances, using the little bit of hatred that has been in this country and amplifying them and making them look larger than life and making people, so, oh, this is it. So they amplify the things and they make them look very large. These are things that already existed. Some of them are not true. Some of them are exaggerated. Some of them are manipulated. They are not explained the way. So they're not necessarily fake news. Of course, there's an aspect of disinformation or misinformation, but there's also the aspect of some element of truth, which they are now taking and twisting and giving it a different complexion. You know, so they're doing that. They're doing the religion. Look at the Russian Orthodox Church, which has basically pushed away the Alexandra Orthodox Church, which used to be the head of the African Orthodoxy, and have a new. So they have basically given money to Orthodox leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, giving scholarship to their children and all of that, just to bring them in. And they have the Russian ex-church that has just been created. And some of these restrictions that were placed on African clergies from the Alexander Church, Russia has now lifted those restrictions. Now we can have African clergy doing some aspect of the Orthodox worship. We have female who are now being ordained and given the right to do things that were not allowed from the Orthodox Church. That is one. Then there is the trade. There is the education, soft power, which is spoke about, using education. There are people who comes in as Russian expert in election, or they do pro-Russian researches and all of that. So these are the things. My own take is that I think to some level, an understanding of what Russia is doing is very clear. I think every expert, anybody who goes in and take a look at these things and see what they're even in Burkina Faso, we have kids in school who are dressed in Russian attire and singing Russian songs, and you have different groups like the African Initiative. There's also the African Initiative Association, which is different from the website African Initiative. The African Initiative Association is the parent organization. The African Initiative is the website is based in Cameroon, but the African Initiative Organization is based in Burkina Faso. You know, and they are doing a lot of stuff, and using all of that to spread using cultural influence. So it's a multi-pronged approach. There is this guy who was, I think, Victor Vasiliev or something, who was maybe in a Slovenia, I don't know, one of the Soviet country. He was convicted for hate murdering. Now he is the one who has come out to say he is the owner. He is the financier of the African Initiative Association, because in Burkina Faso, foreigners are not allowed to create NGOs. You know, but he goes around now. He's now the pro-African guy, and this was a guy who was convicted for murdering on hate crime, which is mostly going to be he murdered a black person, or for hate crime. So we have characters like that. So we have a great understanding of what is happening. Okay, but what I don't see a lot of is what are the counter approaches that the West, in extension Ukraine, I know maybe Ukraine does not have the kind of resources or a lot of that to counter what Russia is doing in Africa, but I think because of limited Ukrainian and African interaction. I know in places like Africa, in Nigeria, for instance, where I'm from, there's a little bit of Ukrainian connection because we get a lot of our wheat from Ukraine. And when the war broke out, it affected the price of bread. For instance, in Nigeria, because we export a lot of wheat from Ukraine. So what is the West and its partners doing? We want to know specifically what approaches are we doing, because Russia has been relentless in it. It's not stopping. Russia is focused, it's multi-pronged approach. Military, education, studies. There is Russian language centers being opened in all parts of Africa. That was not that. People are now being taught Russian languages, getting scholarship, and even some of these. What we are doing now, there have been several series of African journalists who were taken from Africa and brought to Russia based on what is happening. I was surprised when we were approached and said, "Oh, we need to do this," because I was wondering what was the West doing about this. Initially. So I need to understand, this is one of the approaches that I think is being done, but I need to understand what other countermeasures. Do we have countermeasures to tackle people like Kemi Saba and his disinformation and all of that? Because I think fact-checking, which is the go-to approach, doesn't work here anymore. Because some of these facts, some of these means of disinformation cannot really be fact-checked. They're not like plain disinformation, plain falsehood. They cannot really be fact-checked. And you know the way how fake news spread, then you come and you counter it. They are using Telegram, which is becoming very popular in most parts of Africa right now. They have Telegram channels which they use to spread all sort of disinformation. RT is working, the Russian news, national news, they have several of that doing everything. They are opening African Bureau, where they are employing African journalists to do all of these reports and all of that. So what is the approaches that is being done to counter that? Then lastly, I just want to thank him for his explanation of the relation between Ukraine and Crimea. Of course, I know that the annexation of Crimea happened some years ago, but I didn't basically understand why Crimea was very important to Ukraine. I know that it was in Ukrainian territory and there was the annexation, and basically there was little resistance at the time. I know there was some resistance, but there was little resistance at the time to stop, or even from in the international community. I think that step also emboldened Russia to what we are seeing right now, the invasion proper we are seeing right now. So I have a bit of understanding of that. But the question I want to ask again is that the narrative we have heard is that the people of Crimea, because of their Russian origin, because of their closeness to Russia, actually prefer to be under Russian rule than under Ukrainian rule. And because there have been a history of Ukrainian subjugation of the inhabitants of Crimea. These are some of the narratives that were present. So I would love him to explain that, and look at, this is a concern. Because, for instance, if you cannot, people have a right to self-determination. So when a group of people say this is who we want to be, how we want to be governed, I think that should surpass any other consideration, like having access to the sea on the south and all of that. So I would have loved you to explain all of that. So these are the two. Sorry, I've taken too much of time, but these are the two. Yeah. Something of that. Thank you.
Yeah, about Crimea, it's a very interesting question. So, doesn't exist any Crimean nation or Crimean people, especially Russians. What exactly the population of Crimea means? From in the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, Soviet Empire, it was a special politics, special policy to transfer people from Russia to another territories. In 1944, during the Second World War, the Soviet Empire just took Crimean Tatars, which is real original people there. So real original people living in Crimea, it's Crimean Tatars. The motherland, the whole land for these people is Crimea. They don't have any other lands on this planet. So Soviet Empire in 1944, they blamed Crimean Tatars for cooperation with the Nazis, and they took all of Crimean Tatars, it's several hundreds of thousands of people, and moved them to the Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, basically Kazakhstan, some of them, and other countries. So they killed half of these people, the hundreds of thousand people they killed, the Crimean Tatars. And they moved it to Uzbekistan. Only in 1991, Crimean Tatars, after the collapse of Soviet Empire, the Crimean Tatars had a right to return to Crimea, to their homeland, and Ukraine called them to came back to the Crimea, because Ukrainian territory, Crimea, was proposed to Crimean Tatars to return. But Russians, what they done since 1944 till the 1991, they moved a lot of Russian people from Ural or other parts of Russia to Crimea. So instead of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, which actually Ukrainians always blamed by Russians to cooperate with Nazis as well, like the Crimean Tatars, a lot of Ukrainians were moved to Siberia and other parts of Russian Empire, cold parts of Russian Empire, let's say, and then moved there to Russian people. So in 1991, where they got the independent Ukrainian state, together with, of course, the Crimea was a part of Ukraine, the population was artificially changed from the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars. On Crimea started to be not majority, but a lot of Russians live there. And of course, in 1914, when in Ukraine, here, very close to here, we had a Maidan revolution, Russia used the situation where the Ukrainian state didn't have a capability to protect the Crimea. They sent 30,000 of troops, GRU special forces, and occupied and annexed Crimea. And of course, they used the situation when the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars living in Crimea, they didn't have any possibility to protect itself in the situation when Ukrainian state, they didn't have a functionality that time because we didn't have a president, we didn't have a government which has escaped to Russia in February and March 2014, actually 10 years ago, when all of this war started. So it was a very tough period for Ukraine, and Russia used this tough period to occupy Crimea. And after this, of course, they told that you see that the population in Crimea, they supported Russian rules, but not Ukrainian, but it was occupation, real occupation when Ukrainian state didn't have a possibility to protect the territory. And they used all of this, the hybrid warfare to show that Ukrainian state should get out from Crimea and to keep the Russian rules instead of Ukrainian rules. But if we're talking about this time, for example, Russia sent more than 1 million Russians from 2022 and especially since 2014 and especially February 2022 again to Crimea to change the population ratio in favor of Russians. And now they seeing that, of course, you see that it's a majority of Russians living in Crimea instead of Crimean Tatars. A lot of Crimean Tatars, they escaped to Ukrainian part here to Kiev, Lviv, other parts in 2014. So it's actually it's a normal Russian strategy to change the population ratio since Russian Empire in 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and the same in 21st century. And another maybe last thing that if we're talking about the Crimea and Russian strategy in Crimea, you should read a little bit about the Crimean War in 19th century. It's very interesting that in 1856 it was a war in Crimea, but it wasn't war on Crimea actually, but it was a story about Russian Empire trying to get more influence on the Ottoman Empire areas on influence. And at that time, Western alliance, they find a way to push out Russians from Crimea and from the Europe. This time, pretty similar situation. So you should look at the Crimean War in 1856. It's a way to better understand Russian approach now in the 21st century. Because it's everything the same pattern, which is Russian Empire using in 18th century, 20th century, 21st century, doesn't matter. The same pattern. Thank you.
And, just several complete facts about Crimea before 2014. During this period of when Ukraine controlled Crimea, local authorities were mainly pro-Russian, and if we look at the results of electoral campaigns, pro-Russian forces got averagely 60%, and the main opposition were Communist Party, which was even more pro-Russian.
There's a lot of investments from Moscow.
Yes, yeah, of course, and pro-Ukrainian forces got not more than 10 or 12% of votes in Crimea, especially Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. So that means, and also it is important to mention that Crimea was the sole autonomous region in Ukraine. So it had its own constitution, and all the rights of Russian speakers were secured under local legislative and local constitution. So that means that all the attempts to tell that Ukraine suppressed somehow Russians in Crimea is totally untrue. And it's my own perception and my own experience when I came to Crimea before 2014. I didn't feel myself as being in Ukraine, because all the language and all the television was only in Russian. So it is manipulative information. It is manipulation by Russians that Ukraine somehow suppressed Russian. It is completely untrue. And during the period of our second president, Kuchma, it was mainly official policy by Ukraine, and Kuchma told it publicly that it is in Ukrainian interest that Russia will put the money, invest in Crimea, and Kiev thought that that would prevent Russians from intervening, from waging a war. But that strategy was completely failed, as we know nowadays. Thanks. So maybe some other questions.
Yeah,
Or
there's the first question, which is not, I think maybe she was done, that what has been done to counter the hydra-headed Russian approach in Africa? Maybe the guests would answer
Яка
that.
стратегія Заходу?
well, Ukrainian goal is to succeed in a war against Russia because it is existential threat for us, and unfortunately, in terms of informational warfare, we do not feel that the West fully support us. So we should fight ourselves against Russians, and even in informational sphere, because the West has its own interests in different regions. For example, Western countries do not suppress India for buying Russian oil and other goods because they perceive India as a leverage against China. But anyway, that the Indian policy literally fuel the war. So that means that Ukrainian interests in terms of informational warfare are not completely the same as the Western ones. And given that Ukraine is in active war with Russia, that give us much more opportunities to act in more severe, even severe ways against Russians, and also use our military experience. And I think that even, especially in terms of unmanned armed vehicles and drones, technologies will be very important for, and many African countries will be interested in such technologies, and that is the dimension where Ukraine may succeed. But we should also develop our informational strategy, and I'd like to mention that a year ago the communication strategy was between Ukraine and African countries was imposed by Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that is our initial goal to spread Ukrainian presence at the ground through opening new embassies and reaching as much NGOs, experts in local countries as we may, so to portray Ukraine, to explain the ongoing war, and create as much products about Ukraine as we could. But at the same time, there is a hidden dimension of countering Russians' presence in Africa, and it is also our interest to whip out Russians from the facilities, from the countries which Russia used to circumvent sanctions and raise the fundings to wage the war.
Just talking about the Western strategy, I told that actually we, let's say, we cannot recognize the Biden administration, the strategy, because it's very, let's say, problematic. So our experience in war against Russia and Russian war against Ukraine, that Western allies, friends, they don't have any strategy. So they actually in 2014 it wasn't the proper answer to Russia to stop the war, and even in Ukraine we're told that we need to apply the sanctions to stop the Russian capabilities to develop the defense and hybrid capabilities to wage the war, but our Western allies didn't hear us. So since February 2022, when Russians attacked on the full-scale aggression, maybe you know that our Western allies, they thought that Kyiv will be occupied for 3 days and all of Ukraine will be occupied for 2 weeks. It was almost official position of European countries. And it was a surprise for Western countries that Ukraine started to fight and Russians didn't achieve the goals. Still, for our Western friends, it's a surprise. Even still, they cannot understand how it happened, that Russia didn't occupy the Ukraine. And our understanding that we need to create our own strategy based on our national interest. And of course, together with our friends from West, when the main things that they are ready to support us, but strategy should be developed by us. This is the problem. I think that the same in Africa. So when you need to develop own national interest strategy, and after this, everybody will support you. But we cannot wait for West now that they will propose us some strategy and concept. This is a problem. They cannot propose a strategy. Okay, candidate Trump have a lot of strategies in his program. Somebody say that this is very controversial and very unpredictable consequences could be on the global level. But anyway, they have some strategy. Compared to Democrats and Europeans, they basically have a concept literally to wait what is happening, and after this to based on the value approach, not a goal approach. This is a problem. Russians, they have the concrete goals on their strategies, and this is the let's say what Russians can achieve, the concrete results in Ukraine, in Africa, in Asia, whatever, any regions. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. And as I know, we also have some questions from our audience. So if you have just brief question, please, you may ask.
The microphone.
The microphone.
Because for online audience.
So the first question, especially for the journalists from Western African countries. So we see this formation of Sahel Alliance, which has literally pro-Russian stance. How do you evaluate which future do you expect for Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in these circumstances? Could such formation of this alliance provoke some interesting tensions in these countries? Does it pose a threat for example, for Nigeria and Gambia for democratic rule and stability in this region? And the second question for journalists from Kenya and South Africa. It was an information about possible opening of Russian State Information Service RT TV channel in Kenya and South Africa. Do you see the rise of Russian informational activity in your countries? Do you see some movements in this towards this opening of these bureaus, opening of some other Russian state information units in your countries?
Just please, very briefly, because we are running out of the time. So please.
Okay. No. All right. About what influence. Okay. About what does it pose in Africa? Already, you will see that there is a growing pro-Russian narrative across Africa, even particularly West Africa. Even in Anglophone-speaking West Africa, there's a growing pro-Russian narrative. Even among people without ordinary people, they tend to want to justify Russian approaches to that. So I see that as an influence, one. And the other influence we are seeing is that because of Russian incapability, despite its moves to spread, to grow its influence, oftentimes we have found that Russia has failed to be able to have that, to have an efficient control of its using, we are fighting jihadists in the Sahel, for instance, but it does not have the kind of firm control that, for instance, that the world has. Because when United States military and French military were kicked out of Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso and all of that, we are now seeing, recently we saw that the Islamic fundamentalists are spreading even away from Niger and getting into Benin and carrying out attack in Benin that we previously didn't hear of something like that. So what this will mean is that because of Russia inefficiency, we will see more of this jihadist influence in for instance, in the Sahel region of West Africa. And honestly, because of this country, Niger, Mali, and Burkina are not really economically viable countries. They are not. These juntas that are ruling them now, my prediction, this is my personal view, over time they will unravel, and the people will begin to see that they don't have the resources to back or the expertise or to have the control or to rule their countries, and will go back to some of those complaints that they had against the French and the democratically elected government that was backed by the French. Most of them will come back, and the discontent will grow over time. And this, in order to suppress that, this regime will become more brutal against their people to suppress it. So that is what I see happening in the nearest future.
From South Africa's perspective, I think in terms of Russian television channel and the formation of that, and whether there's going to be anything coming up, look, from what I'm understanding right now, there hasn't been much movement on that front, but we do have a television channel for BRICS. All right, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and I think Saudi Arabia as well, who've recently joined, in another country. But I think the general sentiment in South Africa when it comes to BRICS isn't one that's very good among the people of South Africa. Speaking to people, having been a journalist in South Africa for a long time, and speaking to people on the formation of BRICS and their understanding, is that there would have been some sort of collaboration between the countries involved, and we would have seen something come of it as of yet. I know that when Saudi joined BRICS recently, South Africans were thinking that our fuel price was going to plummet. And that hasn't happened, and it doesn't look like it is going to happen anytime soon. I don't know if it's in any plans. So BRICS, as it stands, the general sentiment that I gather from the people I've spoken to over the course of the years is they don't see it as anything significant for the people of South Africa. They see it as more of a political alignment that the South African government, and specifically the ANC, as we know, the ANC's ties rest strongly with Russia and have for many years, given the support that they receive from Moscow and so forth, and the Soviet Union during apartheid. But in terms of disinformation in South Africa on a whole, we've got several institutions in Africa, such as Africa Check and the Institute for Security Studies. Now, the Institute for Security Studies has branches in Senegal, Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa. And they are very quick to jump on disinformation issues, whether there is. Africa Check as well, because what we found in a recent ISS study found that in South Africa specifically, the big media outlets obviously go by proper facts. We're not pulling things out of thin air, and we're not choosing sides. We're reporting on what facts we have from reliable places. But most of the disinformation is coming via X, formerly Twitter. And it's via certain platforms that have started to try and make themselves seem like they're legit media houses, but they're not. And South Africans aren't stupid in that sense that they'll have the world pull over their eyes. When something is gaining traction on X or Twitter and it's seen to be untrue, Africa Check specifically is very active on Twitter. They will quickly jump on it to say this is untrue. These facts are incorrect. So while I think there is a strong tie among many people in South Africa, they have a strong tie to Russia for their historical involvement in assisting South Africa, there are people who don't. There are people who haven't chosen sides. There are people who remain neutral. There are people who are on the side of Ukraine. A lot of people are on the side of Ukraine, from what I understand. So in terms of Russian television, even if it does start, I don't think it's going to get any traction whatsoever. BRICS has started. It's hardly anything. No one's watching it, and they are very much promoting the countries that are part of BRICS. So you will get promotion of Russian stuff via the BRICS channel. But like I say, it hasn't got much traction. No one's really interested in following it religiously.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and unfortunately we're running out of the time, so I'd like to finalize our fruitful discussion, and hopefully we will continue our conversations in the offline format. But as for now, I have to finish our discussion and express my gratitude and thanks to our experts, Mihailo, Marta, thank you so much. And under the description of this video, we will have a text format, so you may follow the description of our in text form our discussion, and there we will mark our final remarks from our distinguished experts. Thank you so much, and keep in touch. Goodbye.